to the first in our annual spring series, Selected Topics in Architecture, our first lecture for this spring. I'll get to that in just a minute, but I did want to remind everybody that our programming here at the Muscarelle Museum of Art is supported by the MCB Foundation and VCU Health, our very strong partners and lead sponsors for each year's Wine and Run for the Roses auction in early May. So many thanks to them for being our partner through these past few years. So before we get started, I remember back when I would come and speak at Selected Topics in Architecture, and my great friend and predecessor, Aaron DeGraft, would want to say a few words before we got started. And those few words would often stretch out a little bit. I think you all remember that. And so we got started a little bit later. I am going to take a page from his playbook today because I want to bring everybody up to speed with just what we have out there for your enjoyment and consumption this spring. So of course, for our members, we have our great friend, Elaine Ruffalo, coming back for a second lecture this spring. She'll be talking to us on March 20th about Padua, Saints, Sinners, and Giotto. And she'll really focus in on that great artist. So I hope you're a member. And if you are, I hope you'll join us on March 20th, once again at 2 p.m., of course, because she's in Florence, and that's 8 p.m. her time. I also want to bring your attention to our really wonderful Muscarelle explorations topic for this spring. As some of you know, and we've had a couple of events so far, we're focusing in on healing by design. And once again, with our sponsor for Muscarelle explorations for this spring, the team at Williamsburg Landing. So just a few of those events that I want to make sure you're aware of. We have a sequence of art therapy workshops led by Sarah Balacio. She's here at William & Mary, and we already had one on February 12th, but we have one next week as well. They begin at noon, they're virtual, and so I hope you'll sign up and I hope you'll join us for that. Coming up shortly thereafter, we'll have a special session led by Dr. Warren Buck, who's an professor of physics here at William & Mary, and he'll talk to us about the healing art of meditation and actually work through some meditation with us. That's March 23rd, 6 p.m., again, virtual. We had a number of very important lectures then coming up in this sequence. We'll be doing a screening of the film, the documentary film, The Healing Wall, which discusses the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. We'll have that film available for screening from March 29th to April 1st. Just sign up through the web, our webpage. And then we'll have a panel discussion on April 1st with Christopher Kaczynski, who was the director of that film, and Jen Scruggs, who is really the force behind why there even is a Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And I'll moderate that conversation. That'll be April 1st at 6 p.m. We have another great lecture coming up in this sequence by Professor of Sociology Kathleen Jenkins here at William & Mary. And she'll be talking to us on March 18th about healing spaces on the Camino de Santiago in Spain. And then our final event, our final lecture for the series, we'll have Michael Arid joining us. He's the architect and the designer of the reflecting pools at the World Trade Center site in Manhattan. To me, those are perhaps the most sublime architectural creation of the past 25 years. I know many of you have been there. It's an amazing place to visit. He's an amazing speaker, and we know we're going to have a big crowd for his talk on April 22nd, once again virtual, and that'll be at 6 p.m. So I hope you join us for all of these events. We really enjoy bringing to you each semester a deep dive into some specific topic. And this year we're talking about how our built environment actually helps us to heal. Well, I also wanted to alert you, I think you've seen in our most recent newsletter, some of the interior shots for our upcoming renovation and expansion project at the museum. This is a little bit of a view of what we anticipate that new wing to look like on the museum. We're going to begin to host some information sessions. And if you would like to join in on one of those webinar information sessions, I would invite you to send me an email. And if you don't know my email address, you can find it on our website. Just look under staff and of course, look under my name and my email address will be there. We're gonna hold a number of these over the course of the next couple of months. If you're interested, please sign up. We are also hoping that we'll have some new donors identify themselves. Any amount is welcome, but we are working hard to complete the fundraising project for this new expansion and really get it underway. We're hoping to break ground by the end of this year. And then to our sequence for today, selected topics in architecture spring of this year. I'll introduce our speaker in just a minute, but our next events will be in April, May, and June. Dr. Jill Lord, William & Mary graduate and a PhD in architectural history, teaching now at the University of Virginia, will be here on April 13th, and she'll be talking about the making and meaning of the international style and that very important exhibition at MoMA in 1932. I've also spoken to you in the past about that exhibition. She's taking a different angle on it. I'll be back to talk with you on May 25th about the architecture of transportation in Washington, D.C. We'll take a deep look at the metro system at Washington Dulles Airport and at Pelly Clark Pelly's transformation of National Airport in the 1990s. And then finally, I'll be back with you again on June 10th, joined by my good friend, Ed Peace, professor here at William & Mary and a fantastic architect in his own right. We're going to talk about the book, Plagued by Fire, The Dreams and Furies of Frank Lloyd Wright. So that's going to be our Muscarelle Reads topic for this spring. So today we have a wonderful art historian joining us, Jane Zaloga. She also is joining us from Florence, hence our afternoon start. Jane has an amazing background. She got her undergraduate degree from Notre Dame, a graduate degree from Syracuse University. She then did extensive additional graduate work at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and from there jumped to a Fulbright, which took her to Florence. She's taught for NYU, for Kent State, for Stanford, but she's currently on the faculty of Syracuse University's program in Florence. She's a wonderful person. I'm sure you're going to enjoy her history of Pienza today. Jane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, David, for having me. This is my pleasure to be here with all of you. So I'd also like to thank Lauren, who is behind the scenes helping us. And I'd also like to thank the museum in general for having me. I have a special place in my heart for William & Mary because one of my very dear friends, unfortunately, no longer with us, but one of my very dear friends, Janino Grody, studied art history at William & Mary, and that basically made her life. So, and her life made my life. So I have a debt to William & Mary. So I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen. And we will get started talking about Pienza today. And let's see, just a moment. I just need to get a couple things started here.
Jane, I'll also remind our audience that if they have questions, they can post them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end of your presentation.
Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you, David. All right, I'm assuming that you can see my screen. Am I good?
Yes, you are good. We can see it.
Okay, great. Then, as David said, what we're going to be talking about today is Pienza, the city of Pienza. And it's, as you see here, in the words of an Italian poet, Giovanni Pascoli, he said that it was a city born of a thought of love and a dream of beauty. So an inspiring sentiment. And I hope that following this talk, you'll be able to appreciate the beautiful Tuscan city of Pienza as he did, and as I do as well. When David asked me to talk about Pienza, I jumped at the chance because it's one of my favorite places in Italy. But usually I talk about Pienza in Pienza. I teach architectural history here in Florence with Syracuse. And so I take my students on a trip to Pienza. And so normally we're talking about it, moving about the spaces and visiting the interiors of the church and the palaces and things such as that. So I'm hoping that my images here today are going to do it justice. All right, let's jump right in then. First off, why Pienza? Pienza is a really small little place in Tuscany. It's a tiny little town. And why is it so important? Why are we taking the time to talk about this? Well, besides the fact that it's rightfully famous for its pecorino cheese, you walk into town and the whole town smells delightfully of cheese. It's going to be a place that's usually talked about, at least in terms of architecture, as the first ideally planned city of the Renaissance. That is, a carefully planned city that evokes a sense of harmony and order. It's a place where the architecture reflects the people who ultimately inhabit it. And it's a city that defines itself in relationship to the countryside around it. In fact, Pienza is in one of the most beautiful landscapes that I've ever seen. It's in an area known as the Val d'Orcia, the Valley of the Orcia River. And as you can see from this photograph, it is breathtaking. Every time I go to this landscape, every time I go to Pienza, I feel like I've gone to heaven. And in fact, some of you might recognize this particular scene because in the movie The Gladiator, Russell Crowe, in fact, did go to heaven, walking right along that road that I'm showing you here. That's where that was filmed. Pienza sits atop a gentle hill in this Val d'Orcia. And one of the things I love about this landscape is how it changes with the seasons, from the lush green of the early spring, as you see here, looking ever the part of the Emerald City. And then it tones down, that green kind of fades away into this soft brown in the heat of the summer, until finally you get this toasty color in the fall. So this part of Tuscany is really exquisitely beautiful. So what part of Tuscany actually is it though? I'm talking to you now, as David said, from Florence. And so Florence here at the top of this map that I'm showing you, we're going to find that Pienza is south of that. It's even south of Siena, and it's located right here, a bit southeast of Siena, the town of Pienza. Although in the period that I'm going to be talking to you about right now, it was actually known as Corsignano. So that is in the 15th century, in the 1400s, Pienza was only in the process of becoming Pienza, because up until that point in time, it was just a tiny little medieval agricultural village that then becomes this perfectly planned city. So that transformation happened right around the year 1459 to 63. And it happened at the behest of its most famous son, Pope Pius II, for whom the city was renamed, leaving behind that moniker Corsignano, and then taking on a name that basically reflects the Pope himself, Pienza. So I'd like us to think about how this happened. We're going to think about the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why, but also, and more importantly, I think, I'd like us to consider what does it all mean to be an ideal city of the Renaissance? Now, that word Renaissance, we all probably know what that means. It basically refers to a time period, the 15th and the 16th century, when we're talking about it here in Italy. But it's even more important than just that chronological moment. It's a moment here in Italy, especially, when people got to be very interested in looking to antiquity as kind of a cultural, artistic, political guide. When we think about that term, Renaissance, in architecture, These are going to be some of the words that usually get bandied about: harmony, order, hierarchy and proportion, geometry and symmetry, axiality. A sense that all of these things come together to create an ideal. Now, let's talk a little bit about the who. So the person behind this project is a man by the name of Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who is eventually becoming Pope Pius II. He was born to a noble family from Siena, although his branch was actually exiled from Siena and they were impoverished. So he was actually born not in the big city of Siena, but he was born in the small agricultural village of Corsignano. He basically helped his father in the fields until he was about 18 years old or so doing hard labor. But then he eventually left Corsignano and he went to study. He went to study at the University of Siena and then later at the University of Florence, and he became a humanist. Now, I've capitalized that word over there on the left-hand side because a humanist in the 15th century is something very specific. It's a person who has a particular kind of an education, which is an education rooted in the classics. Somebody who studied the literature of antiquity, the great books in a sense. Somebody who knows Latin. They're well-versed in politics, in law, in philosophy, in poetry, in religion. And so he is going to be the person who changes this town into Pienza. Now, let's get to know Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini a little bit better. And we can do that, excuse me, I wasn't supposed to do that. We can do that by going to Siena. Here's the Cathedral of Siena. Let's go on inside. And once we're inside, if you've been to Siena, you might know that there is a library located off to the side of the church, known as the Piccolomini Library. And that library is named and in honor of Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini. It was commissioned by his nephew, who also happened to be a pope, Pius III, although he was only a pope for about 20 days or so. There were rumors about regarding poisoning with his quick demise. But we're going to find that Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, his life gets celebrated in this space. And so we can actually read in these paintings, which were done by an artist by the name of Pinturicchio. The young Raphael was helping him there as well. So these were done right at the beginning of the 1500s. We're going to find that the stories of the life of the Pope, which wrap around the walls of this room, begin when he's about 26 years old, when he accepts a post as a secretary to the Cardinal Capranica. And he joins his delegation in a mission to the Council of Basel. And so here we can see the young Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini embarking upon this diplomatic career, surrounded by a huge retinue of people who were traveling with that cardinal. Keep this in mind, all of these people traveling together. Now, I'm just going to walk us quickly through a couple of those scenes so we get a sense of what he was up to before he became the Pope. So he's an ambassador. He goes to the court of King James of Scotland. He eventually gets crowned as a poet laureate by King Frederick III of Germany. He comes back to Italy, where he pays homage to Pope Eugenius IV. And then these frescoes eventually kind of turned around. And we're going to come back to the next wall, where we're going to see his religious career, because he eventually is going to take on a religious role. And so he will become a cardinal. He will then become the Pope, taking the name Pius II. And during his papacy, he is going to preside at the famous Council of Mantua. And what the Council of Mantua was organized for, it was organized at the behest of Pius II. It was supposed to bring together Christian princes, Christian rulers throughout Europe and throughout Italy to embark upon a crusade because Constantinople had just fallen to the Ottoman Turks a few years before. Now, why that is important for Pope Pius II is not so much for the crusade that actually never took place. He died before it happened, but that visit to Mantua was important because in visiting Mantua, he's got to get to the north of Italy. So he's down in Rome, and what he's going to do is go up north to Mantua, and the normal routes to do that would be either to take the famous Via Francigena that took you up to Siena and eventually up to France from Rome, or you could take an alternative route that was another pilgrimage route that would take you up through the Alps and eventually into the German lands. But he decides at that point in time that he wants to stop at this boyhood home of Corsignano that he had not seen in years. And so he makes a slight detour to visit Corsignano. Now, he tells us about this visit in his autobiography. So he writes an autobiography, which is called The Commentaries. And in this, he talks about himself in the third person, but he describes very vividly this journey that he takes to Corsignano. And so he tells us at the beginning of his visit that he arrives and there's a great mountain in the Val d'Orcia, which rises up to a narrow plateau. At the southeast corner stands a little town, which is Corsignano, not much to speak of, but possessed of a healthful climate, excellent wine, and all the other necessities of life. I kind of like the fact that wine is included there in the necessities. And so this is just a little video that I had taken the last time I was there in Pienza that gives you a sense of this beautiful landscape. Okay, his comments then continue as he makes his way into the town. And at that point, he tells us that the greater part of the town once belonged to the Piccolomini. Pius's father, Silvio, had his ancestral estates here, and it was here that Pius was born and passed his childhood. Returning now, he hoped to take some pleasure in talking with his boyhood friends and to be cheered by old familiar sights. So he passes through the gates. And he sees Corsignano, his boyhood home. And he was disappointed. His text goes on, and he says most of the men of his own generation had died, and those who were left kept to their houses, bowed down with old age and illness, or if they showed themselves, were so changed that he could scarcely recognize them, for they were crippled and feeble and seemed to reek of death. Aeneas left when he was 18, a young man. He returns now, an older man. And what he sees, I always think of this as something like the high school reunion effect. When you eventually go to your later high school reunions and you think, everybody's gotten so old. I haven't. But now what he's recognizing is that all of these people who were his childhood friends are reminding him that time has passed. He walks through the alleys, which is what he's seeing as the streets of Corsignano. He sees buildings which are small and dark and run down. Remember, he's been to the major cities of Europe. He's met with kings and queens. And so he's understandably disappointed. The churches are going to be dark and dank. At every step, he says, the Pope met with proofs of his own advancing age. He could not help but admit that he was an old man whose own demise was looming. And those words resonated with him. His own demise. So he asks himself a question. How to live forever? And the answer to that question in the 15th century is to build. Building secures immortality. The Medici did that here in Florence. The Strozzi family did. The Rucellai family did. It was talked about by architects. Leon Battista Alberti was an architect in the 15th century who also was a humanist. He was the person who kind of changed the profession of architecture from being somebody who was a craftsman, a person who was on the job site directing the construction, to somebody who designed remotely, a university-educated person. He writes a treatise on architecture. And in that treatise on architecture, he says that you'll never find anyone who is not eager to build as soon as he has the means to do so, because you have used your wealth to increase greatly not only your own honor and glory, but also that of your family, your descendants, and in fact of your whole city. So building becomes something of personal pride, but also civic pride. We find that he worked for a family in particular here in Florence, the Rucellai family, building the facade of the Church of Santa Maria Novella. He also built the palace of the Rucellai family here in Florence as well. And in both of these cases, he worked with a construction architect, a man by the name of Bernardo Rossolino. And Bernardo Rossolino was a sculptor by trade, so he was a craftsman. And he was going to be a person associated with Alberti, not just in Florence, but he is going to be the person who usually gets the credit as the architect of Pienza as well. And so we have a sense that these men are probably collaborating on this job. Now, here is an aerial view of Corsignano or Pienza. I am just going to flip it around here because in my mind, for some reason, I don't know why, this is the way I always think of Pienza. Now, as you can see from the compass on the upper left-hand side of the screen, in this view, however, south is at the upper part of the screen. Keep in mind that south, north, there was no convention at the time period we're talking about in 15th century in terms of which side it should be on in a map. But I like to look at Pienza this way. Okay, so the first thing that the Pope is going to do is he has a very small plan for this. And what he's going to do is to rebuild the main church and to rebuild his family's palace. But he does this in a pretty bombastic way, in a sense, because the church gets elevated from a pieve, which is a local church, into a cathedral. And so he's going to make it a Duomo. We're going to see that that building is then also going to have a fabulous facade. So raised to the level of a cathedral, it's got a fabulous finished facade, which in the 15th century, when other churches were being built, they didn't necessarily always get finished facades. And so this is the famous Church of San Lorenzo here in Florence, designed by Brunelleschi with its unfinished facade. We're going to see that this facade is not just finished, but it's finished with this classically inspired language of architecture. And so fitting into this humanist tradition, fitting into this idea of the Renaissance. We can see that Leon Battista Alberti did something similar using this classical language in his church of Santa Maria Novella. But in the case of Pienza, we're going to find that there's a different material used here. He's going to use travertine. And travertine is a kind of limestone that's somewhere between regular limestone and marble. It's found specifically in southern Tuscany and in Rome. So if you've been there, you've seen lots of this all over the place. It's got this kind of warm white color. And one of the things it does here in the city of Pienza is it makes a complete break with the rest of the town. Because you'll remember from those earlier images I showed you, the rest of the town is basically faced in brick or rubble construction. So this is going to be a very expensive facade. And it's actually one of the very first finished church facades of the Renaissance. Now, as we walk into the church, we walk up a couple of steps. So we've got a hierarchy. We're raised up from the regular part of the city. We walk through this entranceway where we're flanked by these classical columns. We've got round-headed arches above our heads, and we enter into the church, and we're faced with a space which is flooded with light. It's bright, and it's airy, and it's sunny. We're going to find that there are huge windows towards the back of the church, the south side of the church. So light comes in all day long. We're going to find that the church has high ceilings. It's got white walls. It has this white travertine as the columns. And so we have this brightness, this light. In the 15th century, in Neoplatonic thinking, the presence of God was deemed to be seen on earth in the presence of light. And we know that the Pope writes about this in his autobiography as well. In fact, he's kind of a little bit claustrophobic. And so the darkness oppresses him. And so he needs to have this light. Now, we can see that in having built the building where he did, with the back end of the church facing south, he was actually taking a great risk because the back end of this church is built right abutting a ravine. And so the landscape falls down dramatically behind it. But what that does, that risk that he's taking, is important because it's going to ensure that nothing will ever obscure the light that comes in to the back end of that church. Now, the church itself, here you see on the left, the church in Pienza. This is the church that I'm showing you on the right of San Lorenzo here in Florence. Again, a Renaissance church designed by Brunelleschi. And we're going to see very different characteristics because in that Renaissance church by Brunelleschi, we're going to see that the shape of the church is different. In the church in Pienza, Duomo in Pienza, we have what's called a hall church, a Hallenkirche, which is going to be a Bavarian hall church, something that he saw north of the Alps. And what it does is it's got a tall central part of the church, as you see here, but it also has tall side aisles. And so light and air fills the space, different than what you see at Brunelleschi's church. We're going to see Brunelleschi's church also has this kind of language of architecture, which is very different. Here in the church in Pienza, we've got this Germanic tradition, that is this Gothic tradition with these tracery windows, these lancet windows, these tall pointed windows with stone tracery. We're going to see that in the plan of the church, it is going to be, again, very similar to northern models, where we've got an ambulatory or a walkway that runs all the way around the church. We're going to have radiating chapels, as you had in northern Gothic churches. Brunelleschi's church is a much more geometrical, compartmentalized church in what eventually is going to be a more typical Renaissance tradition. So we might ask ourselves, why is this man, this Pope, who is so steeped in this humanist tradition, why is he looking to this Germanic Gothic or French Gothic model? And part of that has to do with the fact that he's well-traveled. He's been to a lot of places. And so when he went to those northern churches, he liked what he saw. He liked how they were filled with light, and that's what he wants. Okay, even here in the architectural language, you can see on the left in Pienza, you've got these bundled piers that are going to be the supports. In Brunelleschi's church, you have something that looks a lot more like a classical column. If we look at this pier, by the way, this was a video I took when I was in Pienza last time. We come down here, notice that this pier's got additional reinforcement down below. And then if we look at the floor here, we can see that the floor has a major duty crack that then also runs up the side wall. It's kind of stapled together there. Now, what the Pope did is he took a terrible risk in putting this basically on the edge of the ravine. And in fact, the back end of the church is settling dramatically. But again, he was very interested in getting that light into the church. This, by the way, is being monitored architecturally, so nobody's really afraid that it's going to fall off the back of the ravine at the moment. Okay, so here we have a church, which is obviously a splendid addition to this small little town. But the other thing he's going to build then is his palace. And so here on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see his palace. And so one of the things I want you to do is to think about its location right next to the church. So it has a primacy of place. It's in an important location in this piazza that's being created. We can see that the size of the palace is going to be commensurate with the size of the church. So it's not a tiny little palace for a small family, but it's a big palace for an important family that's now being placed on that piazza. We can see that behind it, it's got a garden, what we might think of as a hanging garden, because it's built up on a substructure, because again, it butts up to that ravine that falls off right behind the city center. And then if we think about the building here, we can notice that it's got 3 stories, which is a typical Renaissance palace at this point in time, like what you would have been seeing in Florence as well. We can see that it's got a different, slightly different materiality to it. There's different things going on this. We've got local sandstone as opposed to the travertine. The travertine's more expensive, and so we have a slightly less expensive version here. But we're going to find little bits and pieces of travertine on this building, so it kind of goes together. If we look, for instance, at the windows, we can see that we've got travertine tracery. So just like we saw in the church, we've got tracery here on the private family house as well. And so these 2 buildings are different, but they kind of go together. We're going to see that as we look at this palace, those columns have now transformed into flat pilasters, so a little bit less, let's say, expensive in that regard as well. We're going to see that the door to the palace is slightly off-centered. By the way, this is the Palazzo Rucellai in Florence, so it's very similar to the Palazzo Rucellai in Florence. The door to this palace is slightly off-centered in a certain sense, but it fits in the overall complex, because one of the things we'll note is that what we can see in the piazza is only 4 bays, that is 4 vertical sections of this palace, 1, 2, 3, 4. One of which is taken up, it's blocked by this well or cistern. And so we have the door to the palace central on the 3 bays that remain. We're going to find that the windows, okay, the one on the far right is where we see the family coat of arms, unusually not above the main door, but over here. And I want you to keep that in mind, because we're going to see why that is in just a moment. As we go into the palace, we see that we've got an entrance that comes from the piazza, but then we also have an entrance that comes from the main street, a centrally placed entrance from the main street. And both of these entrances take us into this beautiful courtyard, a courtyard, again, that is just flooded with light. We can see the light color of the materials that are used here. There's going to be that travertine used for the columns. There's a kind of decorative plaster work that looks like stone, in a sense, fake stone up here, which is going to be called sgraffito. We can see the same kind of thing in the Medici Palace in Florence, but at a much darker tonality with the grays that are being used here. Okay, the width and the length of this courtyard, the height of this courtyard, allows light to just fill this space in keeping with the Pope's taste. Okay, as we come into the palace, I'm going to take us immediately upstairs to the Pope's bedroom in this back corner. Okay, that back corner, if we remember the orientation here, is now placed on the southeast corner of the building. So that part of the building that gets the most light. And so the Pope, again, shows us his love for that light. He also suffered from arthritis and things like that. And so the warmth of the sun was also very helpful for him. In that room, that bedroom, is going to be a fresco that commemorates the Pope himself. So this is actually a portrait that was made of him while he was alive that decorates his bedroom. And that bedroom, some of you might recognize the furnishings in that bedroom. This was not his bed. This was from 100 years later. But by the way, the Piccolomini family owned this palace until 1962. And so the furnishings in there were belonging to the Piccolomini family. But as I said, some of you might recognize some of these furnishings because this palace was actually one of the settings for Zeffirelli's famous film, Romeo and Juliet. And so here we see Juliet with that Piccolomini bed. This photograph, it delights me, where you see the young actor and actress playing Romeo and Juliet there in the piazza in front of the church, and they're enjoying their soft drinks with their straws, having a grand old time wearing Renaissance costumes. Okay, another element that we have in this palace is this loggia that runs along the back of the building. Keeping in mind, again, it's the south side of the building. And so that loggia, that porch-like structure, gives us this fabulous light-filled view of the countryside around Pienza. We can see that we look out over that hanging garden where we see geometry and order in this human intervention in nature, this kind of artificed nature. Beyond that wall, then, we see another kind of nature in the Val d'Orcia. We see this cultivated nature where you had the fields with the crops. And then beyond that, in the distance, in the haze that you see here in this photograph, is going to be the wild nature of Mount Amiata, that mountain that was so beloved of the Pope. Another view of the garden. Okay, that garden is going to be framed with its backside to the palace. And so you can see 3 different stories of logge. So each of the parts of the building gets a loggia to look out over the garden. It's going to be framed on one side, on the left-hand side, by the side of the church. And it's going to be framed on the other side by an extension of the palace, which is actually where the kitchens were. So you had a framed view of nature, a controlled view of nature. Okay, let's get back in the piazza then and take a look at some of the other things that are part of this complex. So we've looked at the church, we've looked at the Pope's palace on the right-hand side. Now let's look at the building on the left-hand side. And if we look at it, I want us to start getting a sense that we can read these buildings. One of the things we might notice about this building on the left is that it's smaller than the one on the right, which probably tells us that it's less important than the one on the right. It's going to be less ornamented than the one on the right. And yet it still has features that connect it to both the church and the Pope's palace. This, in fact, is going to be the bishop's palace. So in the church hierarchy, we've got the Pope, and then we have the bishop. And so here we have a sense that this is the lesser building in that regard. We'll notice, however, that it's got still travertine decorations on the windows. Those windows, however, are going to have these cross mullions. Again, comparing it to the first palace, it's going to have those cross mullions, which were actually also in the Pope's palace, in the courtyard. These cross mullions people would have known in the 15th century because these would have identified this building as an ecclesiastic's residence. And in fact, it's the bishop's palace. Okay, we come back out into the piazza. We seem to have finished our survey, except for the fact that you can see another building peeking back there in the distance. Notice that its location is less important again. Its size seems to be less important again, but yet it's visible in the complex. The landscape and the light is visible in the complex here as well. And that last little bit is going to be the canon's palace. So it's the priest's palace. And so in this case, we're going to see that it is definitely much smaller. It's got sgraffito decoration, so that kind of scratched plaster, kind of painted plaster decoration, emulating stone, so not the expensive stone, but something less expensive. Its door is as close as possible to the piazza. Its windows do not have travertine, but they're simply punched windows into the masonry. And so we have each of these buildings kind of holding its place, representing the person that occupies it. Okay, we're also going to see that we don't only have these buildings, but we've got the other side of the piazza that completes this outdoor room. And on the other side of the piazza, then, we've got the town hall. And this town hall is very different than all of the buildings thus far because it's got a very different function. It's a political function. It's not a residence. It's not a church. And yet, even though it's got a political function, it's going to somehow still respond to the main buildings. And so one of the things we're going to see is that it too has travertine. It too has this graffito work. Okay, the travertine that we see on the church, it's got freestanding columns, like we see columns on the church. It's got that graffito that I just mentioned. Okay, and it's got these tracery windows that we've seen on the church and on the Pope's palace. But we're also going to notice that it's got a loggia, so that porch-like structure on the ground story, and a tower up above, because those things basically identify this building as a Tuscan town hall. So we can recognize this building simply because of the things that are on it. We're going to notice that it also has a bell tower and a clock. And a clock is a big deal because the Pope gifted a clock to the town of Pienza. And I want us to think about that for a moment, just how revolutionary a clock would be, a mechanical clock in the 15th century, in this tiny little agricultural village where people lived by the light of the sun, by the setting of the sun. And now you have this mechanical object that kind of relentlessly keeps track of time. And so it's a complete change in a worldview, in a sense, something that's coming from a world bigger than Pienza. And of course, that's what the Pope is coming from. Okay, we also have another element in the piazza, which is this fountain or this well. And so if we look at this, it is the smallest thing in the piazza, and yet it is the most ornate thing in the piazza outside of the cathedral. It is completely in travertine. It is highly embellished with sculptural decoration. It's not set in the center of the piazza where we might think it should be, but it's placed right in front of the Pope's palace. And we're going to remember that the Pope is the benefactor here. So it's a reminder that he is bringing good things to the town of Pienza, including things like water. And that's one of the reasons also why we notice that his coat of arms is located above this. Okay, as we look at the town from above, we've pretty much traced our way around most of the piazza, but we're going to notice that there's a slight gap. And there's this one little building left. So let's take a look at it. And it is the building that we see here on the left-hand side. It looks a little bit nondescript. What is it doing here? It seems like an afterthought, almost as if they kind of didn't get around to finishing the piazza. But there's an interesting essay that was written by Christine Smith, who she suggests that what each of these buildings are doing is they are representing exactly the different kinds of people in Pienza. They're reflecting the different kinds of functions of these buildings in Pienza. And so what she is suggesting is that this is the building that reminds us of that vernacular architecture that was Pienza before the Pope made all these transformations. So you can see it's a simple brick structure, not very ornamented at all, reminding us of those vernacular houses. Now, that pretty much takes us to complete the trapezoidal piazza. But as we look at the piazza, we'll notice that we can also see some other buildings kind of peeking in. If we look at this building next to that vernacular house, you should by now be able to read this. Okay, I trust that you can. We can see these cross-mullion windows. We can see that it's bigger than the house adjacent to it, so it seems to belong to somebody more important. And in fact, this was going to be a cardinal's palace. And so one of the things the Pope did in the town of Pienza, he did a little bit of what I always think of as architectural harassment. He wanted this city to be rebuilt as quickly and as beautifully as possible. And so he basically harangued his cardinals, asking them to buy property in Pienza and to build palaces. And what I'm showing you here is a fresco that's located in the town of Mantua, where he had that council. And this represents the Gonzaga family. In the center of the fresco, you can see Cardinal Francesco Gonzaga, who we know at this time was writing home to dad. Here is his father, the Marquis of Mantua, Ludovico Gonzaga. He was writing home to dad, complaining about the fact that the Pope is haranguing him and he's asking him for money to build this palace. And so he needed some funds from his dad to build his own palace. And so he starts work on that, but did not finish it. And this painting, by the way, is by Andrea Mantegna. Okay, I also want us to think about this for just a moment then, because what we have happening is these cardinals are coming to town and being asked to buy property and rebuild palaces. This is a tiny little agricultural town filled with small little stone rubble construction houses. And so when cardinals travel, as we see from this fresco, they don't travel lightly. They have lots of people as part of their retinue. So I just want us to think for a moment of what changes were going on in this town at this point in time. Imagine the people of Pienza now being faced with these people wearing fancy clothes, riding horses with all of their kind of airs and their accents and their different languages. They can tell time on a clock. They're bringing exotic foods like oranges. And so the whole world of Pienza is being turned upside down. Now, we're also going to find at this point in time that the Pope, in acquiring these properties and also then encouraging his cardinals to acquire properties, didn't want to seem cheap. And so he made sure that he was reimbursing people when they were buying their properties so that they could knock them down and build these new palaces. But this takes us to another question that we need to think about, especially in our own contemporary world, this notion of gentrification. Because these people who live in Pienza, their whole world is changing. For somebody who owns a house in Pienza, they're going to be handsomely compensated to sell their house to one of the newcomers. But at the end of the day, they have to buy someplace else to live, which they might not be able to afford to do given the rise in the housing prices. For people who rent their houses in Pienza, they're just out of luck because they have nowhere to go when their houses are being taken over. And so one of the things the Pope does is he thinks about how he can accommodate these people. And so he builds small houses on the edge of town, these case nuove, which in a certain sense is kind of like the first public housing project. And so what he does is he builds these modest houses at the outskirts of town for people who have been displaced. And so here we can see it butting right up to the city wall at the edge of town. So he's got his important, luxurious part right there in the center, and then housing dispersed around the edge. So Pienza, an ideal city plan that has been looked upon in its 15th century vein, oftentimes as kind of a let's say, training wheels for the 16th century projects like Michelangelo's Campidoglio, where you see these perfectly symmetrical buildings. You see this axial entrance into this trapezoidal piazza. You see this building at the back, which is the culmination, the most hierarchically important building in the square. You see a monument in the center of the square. And so this really represents this completely ideal notion in a Platonic sense of Renaissance architecture in the 16th century plan by Michelangelo of the Campidoglio in Rome, which leaves us with a slightly perhaps imperfect ideal, let's say in Pienza, except again, if we go back to Christine Smith, who suggests that for the 15th century, this idea of people finding their place and having things which are appropriate for them. this kind of rhetorical construction where there's a right way to speak, there's a right way to identify things, is what she is suggesting that Pienza was. So an ideal city that was ideal for the 15th century, the period in which it was built. So at this point, I conclude, and I thank you so much for your attention. It's been my pleasure to be here with you.
Jane, thank you so much. What a great, great tour of Pienza, and with all of the architectural history and layering brought together so beautifully by you. So I'm going to start the questions, and I invite anybody who has a question to post it in the chat. But I actually have a couple, as our audience knows I always do. And my first one is going to be about Palazzo Rucellai and, of course, the Pope's palace here in Pienza. You know, if you take a look at Renaissance buildings, rarely are two buildings paired and compared together more frequently than the Palazzo Rucellai and the Pope's palace here. Of course, Alberti in Florence. And can you talk a little bit more about the linkages between the two of them?
Yeah, it's still quite problematic in the sense that we don't really know which one came first. Giovanni Rucellai, who was the man who had the Palazzo Rucellai built for himself, he kept a notebook, a Zibaldone, which was kind of a family notebook where he kept all kinds of information that he thought was significant. He talks about his building, but he never mentions an architect. Alberti, as an architect, was kind of unusual in the sense that he wasn't a traditional architect, so he wasn't a craftsman. One of the ways we usually trace through history of these things is financial. And so you find out who was being paid to do what. Because Alberti was not a traditional craftsman, he would not have been paid in money, in a sense, for any of these projects. And so he might have gotten favors, he might have gotten other kinds of assets in a certain sense, but he wasn't getting money for these. Bernardo Rossellino does show up in documents for Pienza. And so we definitely have a sense that he was the one who was building it. However, most people would suggest that he was kind of a workaday architect. And so just the vision of the planning seems to be something a little bit intellectually, let's say, above him, which is, of course, not giving enough credit to Bernardo Rossellino. And so people like to think that Alberti would have been somewhere in that mix, because also in 1459 at that council that the Pope had gone to, Alberti was there. Ludovico Gonzaga, who was hosting it, he had copies of Alberti's book. The Pope knew about Alberti's book. And so he was in the air. He was in the air, okay? Which comes first, we're not really sure. In a certain sense, it doesn't make sense for a Pope to be copying a Florentine merchant's palace. It makes more sense for a Florentine merchant to be copying a Pope's palace. And so it's up to debate, but it seems that it's possible that Rucellai came second in that regard.
Okay, that's a great answer. I will tell our audience as well that we recently had gifted to us a very important Stanford White frame, framed around a beautiful painting. We had it restored, and in that frame, Stanford White incorporated sails from the Rucellai's family crest. So it's very interesting. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm going to save mine for last. But Marlene Cummins, who is our head of our docent team at the museum currently, has asked, have you ever seen inside one of the joined houses for the less fortunate people in Pienza? And if people live in them today, how many square feet do they have? Are they modified for people today in terms of a kitchen, bathroom, etc.?
Yes. Thank you, Marlene, for that question. That's a really great question. They are definitely high-end houses now. Everything in Pienza is a high-end house. It's a very, very small little town. It takes you all of about 5 minutes to walk across town in one direction and maybe 7 minutes to walk in the other direction. It's tiny. And so there's not a big population of people who live there. But most of the houses, and especially those houses, those kind of, let's call them popular houses, have been redone. and they're really quite sweet. They're really quite beautiful. I've never been inside one of them though, because they are privately owned.
It looked like it might have become quite a Tony little neighborhood right down there against
It
the
is a
wall.
Tony little neighborhood, but there is a little bit of a sprawl around Pienza. Not much, but a little bit.
Patricia Vantoya is asking, when did the name actually change from Corsignano to Pienza? Do you know what year?
That's an excellent question. And I honestly don't know the answer, because I've just kind of always assumed that it went along with it. But now that you're asking me that question, I would have to check on that. But thank you for that question. I will definitely look into that.
I have another question, which is, you showed us the quite frightening crack running across the floor of the cathedral and up the wall. And of course, Americans are always deeply concerned about what's going on in Venice. There's the Friends of Venice group and, things like that. I'm just curious, what is there a plan for maintaining the structural integrity of the cathedral?
All of these things, it's being monitored all the time. And Massimo Ricci here in Florence, who some of you might know him, he's done a lot of studies on the Duomo, on the cupola of the Florence Cathedral. He is the architect who's been in charge of kind of monitoring this and coming up with plans and making sure that they're keeping it from slipping away. So it is being monitored.
One of my good friends from New York who's joining us, Irina Choi Stern, has commented, we can call the Pope's gentrification of Pienza and displacement of residents as eminence domain from his eminence. So I like that.
Yes, exactly. Nicely
Very
done.
nice,
Nicely done. Absolutely.
Fred Gilbertson is asking us, in 2001, I visited a little village that I recall as Monticello. I believe it was in or a part of Pienza. Where is that?
Yeah, it's very, very close. Monticello. It's very, very close to Pienza. And so, yeah, it's a place that oftentimes if you come, there are beautiful little towns. If you do come, and I highly suggest you do, one of the things that might be nice is to stay in Pienza and then visit all of these beautiful little places outside. Because one of the things that does happen is, because it's such a little jewel, that sometimes it gets kind of overrun with people when people are traveling. Right now it's empty. But when people are traveling, you kind of feel like you're just kind of in this mass of people, which takes away some of the interest of it in a certain sense. And so one of the things I always suggest to people to do is to stay in Pienza, so that you're there in the evening when everybody else goes away, except the people who live there. You get a sense of just walking through the streets and things like that. And then you can go and visit those smaller little towns like Monticello, like San Quirico d'Orcia, and really have a sense of that Val d'Orcia, which again is just this beautiful, beautiful place. So you come to Pienza and eat cheese.
It's definitely on my list. Now, I've yet to meet the person who has visited Tuscany who doesn't want to move to Tuscany. So all of these little towns are always remarkably charming and appealing in so many different ways.
Yes, they are.
Well, Jane, I don't think we have any more questions. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. You are a wonderful speaker.
Thank you again, David, for having me. Thank you, museum.
And we really enjoyed our time with you today. I also want to thank Lauren Green, a member of our team at the museum, who has helped to produce today's program. I think we've gotten very good at these at the museum over the course of the past year, and we plan to do many more in the future. So everybody have a great day. Thanks for being a part of the program today. Thanks for supporting the Muscarelle Museum of Art. So long, Jane.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.